The quiet neighborhood. In the serene neighborhood of Cedarwood Grove, evenings unfolded like a scene from a classic painting. The neighborhood was known for its well-maintained streets, lined with towering oak trees that cast long shadows as the golden hues of sunset melted into the horizon. The air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mingling with the aroma of dinners being prepared in cozy homes. For its residents, life moved at a deliberate, unhurried pace, marked by neighborly waves and children's laughter echoing through the cul-de-sacs. Among its most cherished inhabitants was 72-year-old Walter Grayson. Walter was a man of quiet strength and indomitable spirit, navigating life from the seat of his electric wheelchair. Cedarwood Grove had been his home for nearly half a century, a place where he had raised his family, watched his children grow, and buried his beloved wife, Marjorie. Despite the years etched on his face and the limitations of his body, Walter was a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the notion that life, though fragile, could still be lived with dignity. Walter's days were marked by routine, a sacred rhythm that brought him comfort and connection. Each evening, as the sun began its descent, Walter would venture out on his electric wheelchair to the small general store a few blocks away. The trip, though modest, was a cornerstone of his independence. The staff at the store knew him by name, and the neighborhood kids often ran up to greet him, their youthful exuberance a stark contrast to his measured pace. This evening was no different. Dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and a light jacket, Walter adjusted his scarf as he rolled down the sidewalk, his wheelchair humming softly beneath him. He waved at familiar faces, Mrs. Jensen watering her garden, young Timmy practicing his skateboard tricks, and the Harris twins walking their golden retriever. These interactions, though brief, were threads in the fabric of Walter's life, reminders that he was still part of a community that valued him. The general store stood at the corner of Maple and 3rd, a quaint establishment run by the ever-cheerful Martins family. Walter entered the store, greeted by the warm chime of a bell. Inside, the shelves were lined with everyday essentials, their neat arrangement reflecting the care of the owners. Maria Martinez, the matriarch, greeted Walter with a smile that reached her eyes. "Evening, Mr. Grayson. The usual today?" she asked, her voice a melody of warmth and familiarity. Walter nodded, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Just the essentials, Maria. Bread, milk, and maybe an apple or two." As Walter made his way through the store, he moved with the precision of a man who had done this countless times before. He picked up a loaf of whole-grain bread, a carton of milk, and a pair of crisp green apples, placing them gently in the basket attached to his wheelchair. The routine was simple, yet it grounded him, offering a sense of normalcy that he cherished deeply. At the counter, Maria rang up his items, chatting about the upcoming neighborhood potluck. Walter listened intently, his eyes crinkling with amusement at her tales of Mr. Jensen's infamous potato salad. After paying and exchanging a few more pleasantries, Walter turned toward the door, the evening awaiting him. The journey back home began like any other. The streetlights flickered to life, casting a soft glow over the sidewalks as twilight descended. Walter hummed a tune under his breath, his mind wandering to the potluck and whether he should bring Marjorie's old recipe for apple pie. As he approached the intersection at Willow and 5th, the tranquility of the evening was interrupted by the sharp wail of a police siren. Walter froze, his heart skipping a beat as a patrol car pulled up beside him. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in jarring hues, disrupting the calm that Cedarwood Grove was known for. The officer stepped out of the car, his expression unreadable, his posture authoritative. Walter, ever composed, came to a halt, his hands resting on the controls of his wheelchair. "Good evening, officer," Walter said politely, his voice steady despite the unease creeping into his chest. "Is there something I can help you with?" The officer, a young man with a sharp jawline and an air of impatience, didn't immediately respond. Instead, his eyes scanned Walter from head to toe, lingering on the wheelchair as if trying to decipher a hidden threat. The silence stretched uncomfortably, the officer's demeanor radiating tension. "Sir, I need you to stay right where you are," the officer finally said, his tone curt and commanding. Walter's brow furrowed in confusion. "Stay here. May I ask why?" "Officer, I've done nothing wrong." The officer's gaze hardened, and his hand rested on the belt where his pepper spray hung. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, a signal that the situation could escalate at any moment. Walter, who had always prided himself on his calm demeanor, felt a flicker of unease. He had seen stories in the news about misunderstandings spiraling out of control, but never in his life had he imagined finding himself at the center of one. "Listen, old man," the officer said, his voice tinged with irritation. "I said stay put. You're acting suspicious." Walter blinked, stunned by the accusation. Suspicious. He was a 72-year-old man in a wheelchair returning home from the store. What about that screamed suspicion? He gestured to the bag of groceries resting in his lap, his voice firm but measured. "Officer, I'm just an old man trying to get home. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 40 years. Surely there's been some mistake." But the officer wasn't listening. His hand moved swiftly, grabbing the canister of pepper spray. Before Walter could react, a sharp burst of the chemical mist hit him square in the face. The pain was immediate and searing, his eyes burning as though they were on fire. He gasped, his hands instinctively flying to his face in an attempt to shield himself. "What? What are you doing?" Walter cried, his voice trembling with a mix of pain and disbelief. The officer stepped back, his expression unchanging, as if he had done nothing more than follow protocol. Walter's world became a haze of agony, his vision blurred by tears, his throat tightening as the fumes assaulted his senses. He struggled to catch his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. From across the street, a voice rang out, sharp and furious. "Hey, what are you doing to my father?" Walter's ears perked up despite the burning in his eyes. That voice, it was familiar. It was strong, commanding, and filled with a mix of rage and disbelief. He struggled to open his eyes, the sting making it almost impossible, but he knew who the voice belonged to. It was his son, Daniel Grayson, a man known not just in Cedarwood Grove, but across the nation. Daniel wasn't just any man. He was a leader, a symbol of justice and compassion, a man whose voice had the power to change lives. And tonight, that voice carried a fury that would not be silenced. The weight of power, the voice cut through the fog of pain like a lifeline. Walter's mind, clouded by the sting of pepper spray and confusion, latched onto it. It was Daniel, his son. His heart, still racing from the shock of the attack, swelled with a mixture of relief and worry. What was Daniel doing here? How had he arrived at this precise moment when Walter needed him most? Walter could hear his son's footsteps pounding against the pavement, closing the distance between them. The officer, startled by the sudden intervention, turned sharply toward Daniel. The authoritative presence of the man bearing down on him was unmistakable. Daniel Grayson wasn't just anyone. He was a man who carried the weight of his convictions like armor and wielded his words like a sword. The officer's eyes widened slightly as recognition dawned. It wasn't immediate. Daniel wasn't in his usual tailored suit, nor was he flanked by security or cameras. He wore jeans and a simple sweater, his hair slightly disheveled, but his posture was every bit as commanding as when he addressed national audiences. This was a man who wasn't accustomed to being ignored. "Step away from him," Daniel ordered, his voice low and dangerous. The officer hesitated, his hand instinctively moving toward the pepper spray on his belt again. But something about Daniel's presence gave him pause. He glanced down at Walter, who was still reeling, his hands clutching his face, his body trembling in the confines of his wheelchair. "Sir, this isn't what it looks like," the officer began, his voice faltering. What it looks like," Daniel interrupted, his voice rising. "It looks like you just attacked a defenseless man in a wheelchair. My father." The words hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. The officer stiffened, but his confidence was visibly shaken. "I thought," He looked suspicious. I was just following protocol. Suspicious, Daniel snapped, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. An elderly man, in a wheelchair, carrying groceries looks suspicious to you. Walter, still unable to see clearly, felt his son's hand on his shoulder, steadying him. That touch grounded him, even as the world around him spun in a haze of pain and chaos. He tried to speak, to reassure Daniel that he was all right, but the words stuck in his throat, choked by the acrid burn of pepper spray. Daniel turned his full attention to the officer, stepping closer. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he demanded, his voice sharp enough to cut through the tension. "You didn't stop to ask questions. You didn't think for 1 second about the person in front of you. You saw a man in a wheelchair and decided he was a threat." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Daniel didn't give him the chance. "You attacked my father without cause, without reason, and now you're trying to justify it with some flimsy excuse about protocol." His voice was calm, but the fury beneath the surface was unmistakable. "You're going to be held accountable for this." Around them, neighbors had begun to gather. People peeked out of windows and stepped onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. The flashing lights of the patrol car illuminated the growing crowd, their murmurs rising as they took in the scene. Many recognized Walter, their longtime neighbor and friend. The sight of him hunched in his wheelchair, his face red and raw, filled them with a mix of shock and anger. "Is that Mr. Grayson?" someone whispered. "What's going on?" another asked, their tone incredulous. Daniel glanced at the gathering crowd, his jaw tightening. He had spent his career fighting for justice, for the rights of the marginalized and the voiceless. And now, here in the quiet neighborhood where he had grown up, that fight had become deeply personal. Walter finally managed to speak, his voice hoarse and shaky. "Daniel, I'm okay," he rasped, though it was clear he was far from it. Don't make a scene." Daniel knelt beside his father, his expression softening as he looked at the man who had raised him. "Dad, this isn't just about you. This is about every person who's ever been treated like this. It's not right." Walter's hand reached out, trembling, to grip his son's arm. "I know, son," he said quietly, "but this isn't how I wanted you to get involved." Daniel's eyes softened, a hint of pain flickering across his face. He placed a reassuring hand over his father's, silently promising that he wouldn't let this go unanswered. The officer, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted on his feet. "Look, I didn't know he was your father," he said defensively. "If I'd known." Daniel shot to his feet, cutting the officer off with a glare. "You didn't need to know who he was. That's the point. It shouldn't matter if he's my father, or someone else's, or no one's at all. You had no right to treat him like this." The officer's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The weight of Daniel's words, combined with the watchful eyes of the growing crowd, left him floundering. By now, someone had called for emergency medical assistance. A siren wailed in the distance, drawing closer. Daniel turned his attention back to his father, crouching beside him once more. "Help is on the way, Dad," he said softly. "Just hold on." Walter nodded weakly, his strength waning. He hated feeling like this, helpless, vulnerable, but he took comfort in his son's presence. Daniel had always been his protector, even as a boy. He thought back to the countless times Daniel had stood up for others, the way he had carried that sense of justice into his adulthood. And now, here he was, standing up for his father in a way Walter never expected to need. The ambulance arrived moments later, its lights casting a harsh glow over the scene. Paramedics rushed to Walter's side, gently examining his face and administering first aid. Daniel stood back, his arms crossed, watching every move they made to ensure his father was cared for properly. As the paramedics worked, Daniel turned back to the officer. "What's your name?" he asked, his tone icy. "Officer Reynolds," the man replied, his voice subdued. "Well, Officer Reynolds," Daniel said, "I hope you're ready to explain yourself. To your department, to the people in this neighborhood, and to the press. Because believe me, this story isn't going away." The officer paled at the mention of the press. He looked around, realizing that several people in the crowd had their phones out, recording the entire interaction. The weight of his actions, once justified in his mind as protocol, now felt like a millstone around his neck. The ambulance doors closed with Walter safely inside, and Daniel climbed in after him. As the vehicle pulled away, leaving behind a stunned and murmuring crowd, Daniel reached for his father's hand. "It's going to be okay, Dad," he said softly. "I'll make sure of it." Walter squeezed his son's hand weakly, a small grateful smile crossing his lips despite the pain. "I know you will, son. I've always known." As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Daniel's mind raced. This wasn't just about his father. It was about something bigger, an opportunity to shine a light on the injustices that too often went unchecked. He didn't know what the next steps would look like, but one thing was certain: this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Unraveling the truth. The cool, sterile air of the emergency room did little to ease the tension that hung over Daniel as he sat beside his father, watching as the doctors worked to treat the chemical burns on Walter's face. The paramedics had done their best during the ride to the hospital, but Walter's eyes were still swollen, his skin raw and blistered. Despite the pain, Walter remained as composed as he always had, but Daniel could see the strain in the lines of his father's face, a testament to the horror of the evening. The events of the past hour were a blur in Daniel's mind. He'd been racing on autopilot, moving from one task to the next, managing the chaos without fully processing the gravity of the situation. He'd just learned that his father, a man who had spent his life as a pillar of the community, had been attacked by a police officer. And what was worse, his father had been wrongfully targeted, solely because of his age and the fact that he used a wheelchair. Now, sitting in the hospital room, Daniel's thoughts were consumed by one thing: accountability. The officer, Officer Reynolds, had acted without reason, without thought. But that wasn't the end of the story. This was only the beginning of something far bigger, a reckoning that Daniel knew would echo far beyond Cedarwood Grove. Walter, despite the pain, reached out and took his son's hand, breaking through Daniel's thoughts. His grip was surprisingly strong for someone who had just suffered an attack, and it brought a sense of calm to Daniel's racing heart. "Son," Walter began, his voice still hoarse but steady, "I don't want you to cause a scene over this. It's done now. I'll be fine." Daniel shook his head, not able to hide the frustration that bubbled up inside him. "No, Dad. This is far from over. That officer, he has to answer for what he did. He can't just get away with it because of some excuse about following protocol." Walter's face softened, his lips twitching into a smile despite the pain. "You've always been the one to fight for what's right, Daniel. But sometimes, son, it's about picking your battles. This isn't your fight." Daniel leaned in closer, his voice low but filled with intensity. "It's my fight because it's your fight, Dad. You've spent your life fighting for others. You raised me to fight for what's just. How can I just walk away from this?" Walter's eyes flickered with pride, but also with a hint of sadness. "I didn't raise you to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. You have your own battles to fight." Daniel didn't respond immediately. The thought of letting the officer's actions go unchallenged felt impossible, yet his father's words weighed heavily on him. The conflict between his duty to his father and his responsibility to his community was sharp, like a blade slicing through his resolve. Just then, the door to the hospital room opened, and a nurse stepped in with a clipboard, followed by a doctor who introduced herself as Dr. Angela Morris. She gave Walter a reassuring smile before turning to Daniel. "We've treated the worst of it, Mr. Grayson," Dr. Morris said. "Your father will need some time to rest and recover, but the burns should heal without long-term damage." "Thank you, Doctor," Daniel replied, his voice still strained. He looked at his father, who nodded faintly, grateful for the reassurance. "Is there anything more we need to do?" "No, Just keep him hydrated and monitor the symptoms for any further irritation. I'll check in later to see how he's doing," she said before leaving the room. Once they were alone again, Daniel stood by the window, looking out at the city skyline. His mind raced. The officer had made a grave mistake, and Daniel knew he needed to find a way to bring that to light. But the deeper question gnawed at him. How could such an incident happen in the first place? The thought of Walter, an elderly man who had dedicated his life to his community, being treated as a threat because of his age and physical limitations, filled him with rage. He could feel the embers of his father's teachings smoldering within him, teachings that had shaped Daniel into the man he had become. Walter had always taught him that integrity and honor were the most important things a person could possess. But now, Daniel had to reconcile that lesson with a world that didn't always see things the way he did. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Daniel turned to see a familiar face. Detective Linda Hayes, an old colleague and friend, entering the room. "Daniel, how's your dad?" she asked, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "He'll be okay," Daniel replied, offering a small nod. He hadn't seen Linda in months, but she had been an ally in many of his past endeavors, and he was glad to have her here now. "But I need your help, Linda." Linda looked at Walter, who gave her a weary but grateful smile. Then she turned back to Daniel, sensing the gravity of the situation. "I know what happened," Linda said, her voice soft, but filled with an unspoken understanding. "I was at the scene shortly after the ambulance left, but I didn't realize it was your father." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I don't care who he is, Linda. He's a man, an elderly man, who was attacked because of assumptions. It's not right, and I need you to help me get the truth out there." Linda nodded slowly. "I agree. This isn't just about your father. It's about something much bigger, Daniel. We've seen too many cases where things like this get swept under the rug, but we have to make sure this one doesn't." Daniel's heart gave a slight flutter at her words. He knew she was right. The situation had the potential to spark more than just a local outcry. It could become a turning point, one that could expose the deeper issues of bias, profiling, and injustice that were too often hidden beneath the surface of everyday life. "I'm not going to let this go, Linda," Daniel said firmly. "That officer is going to face consequences for what he did. But I need you to help me gather the facts, talk to witnesses, and make sure everything is documented. I won't let them cover this up." Linda gave him a supportive look, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this, I promise." As Linda left to start gathering information, Daniel returned to his father's side, taking the seat next to him. Walter's eyes were heavy with exhaustion, but he still managed to crack a smile. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" he asked, his voice tired but warm. "No, Dad," Daniel replied, his voice firm. "I can't. Not after everything you've done for others, everything you've taught me about standing up for what's right. I can't just walk away from this. I'm going to make sure no one else goes through what you did tonight." Walter's hand squeezed his son's again, this time with more strength than before. "I raised you to fight, Daniel. Just remember to fight for the right reasons, and don't let your anger consume you. Sometimes, the hardest battles are fought with patience." Daniel nodded, though the fire in his chest was still burning strong. "I'll keep that in mind, Dad. But right now, my fight is for you." Walter smiled, his eyes glinting with pride. "Then fight it, son. Make sure this never happens again." Daniel sat in silence for a moment, reflecting on his father's words. He wasn't just fighting for Walter. He was fighting for every person who had been mistreated, misunderstood, or ignored. And he was going to make sure this officer's actions were held accountable, no matter the cost. The battle had only just begun. The echo of justice. The sun had barely risen the next morning when Daniel Grayson made his way to the office of the Cedarwood Grove Police Department. The night's events still weighed heavily on his mind, but the adrenaline that had kept him moving for hours had begun to ebb, leaving a quiet, simmering resolve in its place. Walter was at home, resting after the painful ordeal. The doctors had assured him that the physical wounds would heal in time, but the emotional scars would take longer to fade. Daniel knew that the road ahead would not be easy, not for him, and not for his father. The early morning light filtered through the tall, narrow windows of the police department, casting long shadows across the whitewashed walls. Daniel stepped into the sterile lobby, greeted by the sharp hum of fluorescent lights and the distant murmur of police radios. Behind the front desk, an officer glanced up, recognition flickering in his eyes as Daniel approached. "I need to speak with Chief Harris," Daniel said, his voice cold but composed. The officer nodded and picked up the phone, speaking briefly into it before hanging up. "The chief will see you now, Mr. Grayson. Please, right through here." Daniel gave a terse nod, his eyes narrowing slightly. He had no time for pleasantries, not today. Not when his father, a man who had spent his entire life fighting for justice, was nearly assaulted in his own neighborhood by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. This wasn't just a personal matter. This was a statement. He followed the officer down a narrow hallway and into the chief's office. Chief Harris was sitting behind a large desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She was a no-nonsense leader, known for her sharp intellect and years of service. But today, her usual calm demeanor seemed somewhat strained, as if she had known this moment was inevitable. "Mr. Grayson," she said, rising from her chair and offering a tight smile, "what brings you to my office so early this morning?" Daniel wasted no time on pleasantries. "I'm here about the incident last night. My father, Walter Grayson, was attacked by one of your officers. I want an explanation." The chief's expression didn't change, but Daniel could see the shift in her eyes. She had been briefed, and she knew what was coming. Still, she remained professional. "I understand, Mr. Grayson," Chief Harris replied, her voice measured. "We're conducting an internal investigation into the officer's actions. I assure you, this will be handled appropriately." Daniel clenched his fists at his sides. Handled appropriately. An elderly man in a wheelchair was pepper-sprayed by one of your officers for no reason. "Chief, that's not an appropriate response. I want accountability. I want to know why your officer acted the way he did, and I want to know why you didn't intervene sooner." The chief leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. "I can see you're upset, Mr. Grayson. I'm not dismissing the seriousness of what happened. But you need to understand something. This isn't as simple as it seems. Officers are trained to make quick decisions based on what they observe in the moment. If an officer feels threatened, they're taught to de-escalate, yes, but they're also taught to protect themselves." Daniel's patience was thinning. "You're telling me that a 72-year-old man in a wheelchair, carrying groceries, is a threat to an officer?" Chief Harris didn't flinch, but her eyes flickered momentarily. "I'm not justifying the officer's actions, but I can't say what was going through his mind in that moment. All I know is that the officer acted with what he believed was necessary force. The investigation will determine whether that force was warranted or not." Daniel shook his head, his frustration mounting. "The investigation. This isn't something that can be swept under the rug, Chief. My father is a respected member of this community. He's not some random person who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's an old man who spent his life building this town and raising a family, and now he's been attacked in cold blood." There was a long silence between them as Chief Harris seemed to weigh his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now, though still firm. "I understand your anger, Mr. Grayson, but I need you to understand that these situations are complicated. The officer involved is relatively new to the force. He's still learning how to assess and handle different situations. What happened last night was a failure on his part, but it's also a failure of the training we provide." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He could see that Harris was doing her best to keep the situation under control, but there was no way he was going to back down. "Not now." "I don't care about his learning curve," Daniel said coldly. "I care about the fact that my father was hurt. He was treated as a threat, and I won't let that go unchallenged." Chief Harris's eyes narrowed, but her tone softened even further. "I understand, Mr. Grayson, and I promise you that this will not go unnoticed. We'll follow the proper procedures and hold the officer accountable for his actions. But I also need you to understand that this will take time. Investigations don't happen overnight." Daniel took a step closer to the desk, his eyes locked on the chief's. "Time is something I don't have, Chief. My father's been fighting for this community his entire life. And now you're telling me that the man who was supposed to protect him is going to get away with it because you need more time? No, that's not how this is going to end." The words hung heavy in the room, but before Chief Harris could respond, Daniel's phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. It was Linda Hayes, the detective who had been helping him gather information about the incident. He answered quickly, holding up a finger to the chief, signaling for a moment of quiet. "Linda." Daniel's voice was tense. "What do you have for me?" "I've spoken to a few witnesses from the neighborhood, Daniel," Linda said, her voice steady but urgent. "They're all saying the same thing. Officer Reynolds was aggressive, even before he approached your father. He didn't ask any questions. He didn't try to assess the situation. He just saw an elderly man in a wheelchair and decided to act." Daniel's pulse quickened. This was the confirmation he needed. "Get me those statements, Linda. I'm going to need them for the press conference. I want everyone to know the truth." "I'll have them ready," Linda said. "But there's more. I managed to get my hands on the body cam footage from Officer Reynolds. It's not great quality, but it shows everything leading up to the attack. I'll send it over to you." Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline. "That's what we need. Thank you, Linda. We'll be in touch." He ended the call and looked back at Chief Harris, who was watching him closely. "I'm done waiting for procedures," he said, his voice unwavering. "This officer's actions are going to be exposed. The public has a right to know how this happened, and I won't let them sweep it under the rug." Chief Harris didn't respond immediately, but her expression had shifted. There was no more defensiveness in her eyes, only the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. "I see you're not going to let this go, Mr. Grayson. I'll do what I can to expedite the process. But understand this. The fallout from this is going to be far-reaching. It won't just affect Officer Reynolds. It'll affect the entire department." "That's the point, Chief," Daniel replied, his voice resolute. "Sometimes the truth has to shake things up in order for real change to happen." With that, Daniel turned on his heel and walked out of the office, his mind already racing ahead to the next steps. The investigation was just the beginning. He had the evidence. He had the witnesses, and soon he would have the truth. But this wasn't just about a wrongful assault on his father. This was about something bigger, the way systems of power often turned a blind eye to injustice, and the fight to bring that truth into the light. Daniel had fought for justice his entire life, and now, more than ever, he was ready to do whatever it took to make sure that justice was served. The weight of truth. The days following the confrontation with Officer Reynolds passed in a blur for Daniel. Each moment was spent juggling interviews, preparing statements, and coordinating with Linda and his team. His phone had never stopped ringing. The media had caught wind of the incident, and soon Cedarwood Grove was in the spotlight. The small town, once a quiet haven of peace, had become a battleground for a much larger fight, one that spoke to the heart of systemic issues, perceptions, and the struggle for justice in a world that too often looked the other way. The press conference Daniel had been planning for days was scheduled for late Friday afternoon. It would be a moment of reckoning, not just for Officer Reynolds, but for the entire police department. Daniel had made it clear this would not be a one-sided story. His father's assault had been an unfortunate event, yes, but it was also a symptom of something much larger, something that needed to be addressed before it spiraled out of control. It was late in the afternoon when Daniel and Linda sat in the conference room of the town hall, preparing the final details. They had gone over the body cam footage several times, each viewing more devastating than the last. The video showed Officer Reynolds approaching Walter with no attempt to communicate, no offer to understand, just an immediate escalation that led to the unjust use of pepper spray. Daniel's heart tightened each time he saw his father's pain on the screen, but the anchor that once fueled him had turned into a calm determination. This wasn't about revenge or retribution. It was about ensuring that this type of violence wasn't allowed to continue, that no one else would ever have to endure such an experience. Linda was pacing the room, adjusting the final details of the press release. "We've got the media lined up outside," she said, her voice steady but laced with a hint of nervous anticipation. "But you know this won't be easy. There'll be pushback. Some will say this is a misunderstanding, that Reynolds was just following orders. Others will try to shift blame elsewhere. Are you ready for that?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, but he knew that this was the only way forward. He had made the decision long ago to stand up for what was right, even when the consequences were unclear, even when the odds were stacked against him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice unwavering. "If we don't stand up now, nothing will ever change. This is bigger than my father. This is about how we view authority, how we treat the most vulnerable in our communities. We can't let this become just another story that fades into the background." Linda nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of admiration and understanding. "I'll be right by your side, Daniel. You're not alone in this." The room fell into silence as they both gathered their thoughts. Daniel's mind wandered briefly to his father, who was resting at home. He hadn't wanted to burden Walter with the weight of the press conference, so he'd insisted his father stay home and recover. Walter had agreed, though he'd insisted on watching the coverage from the comfort of his living room. Daniel knew his father was proud of him, but he also understood the pain that Walter must have been feeling, the injustice of it all, the betrayal. At that moment, the door to the conference room opened, and the first few reporters trickled in, followed by a small group of town officials. The buzz in the room grew as the cameras were set up, and reporters shuffled to take their seats. Daniel straightened up, adjusting his tie, and took a deep breath. He could feel the eyes on him, the weight of their expectations, but it wasn't the reporters he was concerned about. It was the people of Cedarwood Grove, the ones who had trusted the police to protect them, the ones who had seen this town as a refuge from the world's harsh realities. Today, Daniel wasn't just speaking for his father, he was speaking for them too. The room fell silent as Daniel walked to the podium. He paused for a moment, looking out over the sea of faces before beginning. "Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Grayson, and I'm here today to speak on behalf of my father, Walter Grayson. What happened last night was an attack, a senseless, unprovoked assault by a police officer who failed in his duty to protect and serve." A murmur swept through the room, but Daniel held up a hand, his gaze unwavering. "My father is 72 years old. He's been a member of this community for over 40 years. He's raised a family here, worked hard, and contributed to making Cedarwood Grove the safe, welcoming place that we all cherish. He's a man who has never caused harm to anyone. And yet last night, he was attacked for no reason other than his age, and the fact that he was using a wheelchair, and when he asked why, the officer didn't listen. Instead, he used force, pepper spray, to subdue him, despite the fact that my father posed no threat to anyone." Daniel paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. The reporters were silent, hanging on his every word. "This is not just about a man in a wheelchair being attacked," Daniel continued. "This is about how we, as a community, allow this type of behavior to go unchecked. It's about how we see people, especially the vulnerable, and whether we choose to show empathy and understanding, or whether we make assumptions based on appearances. My father was treated like a criminal because of his age and his physical limitations, and that is unacceptable." There was a hushed silence in the room. Daniel's words had hit their mark. He could feel the weight of them hanging in the air, the gravity of the truth settling in the hearts of everyone present. The officer involved, Officer Reynolds made a decision that night that will have lasting consequences. He acted rashly and without thought, and he'll have to answer for that. But this isn't just about one officer. This is about the culture of policing that needs to change. It's about the need for training that emphasizes communication, empathy, and understanding. It's about making sure that no one, no matter their age, race, or physical ability, ever has to face this kind of mistreatment again. A reporter raised her hand, and Daniel gestured for her to speak. "Mr. Grayson," the reporter said, "what do you plan to do about this? Are you taking legal action? Will there be a formal investigation into the police department's practices?" Daniel nodded, his jaw clenched. "Yes, there will be legal action. We're filing a formal complaint against Officer Reynolds and the police department. But beyond that, I want to make sure that this never happens again. This isn't just about punishment, it's about change. We need an independent review of the police department's practices, training, and protocols. We need accountability at every level, and we need to ensure that the people we trust to protect us are held to the highest standards." Another reporter raised a question. "And what about the officer involved? Officer Reynolds. Do you believe he should be fired?" Daniel's expression hardened. "I believe Officer Reynolds should be held accountable for his actions. He needs to face the consequences of what he did, and I believe those consequences should reflect the severity of his actions. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." The room buzzed with questions, but Daniel continued to stand firm, answering each one with the same level of determination. The truth was out now, and he wasn't going to back down. His father's dignity, the safety of his community, and the future of Cedarwood Grove depended on it. As the press conference concluded, Daniel stepped away from the podium, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and anxiety. The battle wasn't over, but this was a crucial first step. His message had been heard, and now the world was watching. What happened next would determine whether real change could take root, or whether the old ways would continue to dominate. But for now, Daniel knew one thing for sure. He had done everything in his power to ensure that the truth had been told. And with that, he could finally breathe. The fight was just beginning, but at least now it had a voice. The aftermath of change. The following days were filled with intense scrutiny and media coverage. Cedarwood Grove, a town once largely ignored by the outside world, now found itself at the center of a nationwide conversation about police brutality, racial profiling, and the treatment of the elderly. The press conference had ignited a firestorm, the ripple effects of Daniel's words spreading far beyond the small, quiet town. But with the attention came pressure to follow through, to ensure that the promise of change was more than just words. For Daniel, each morning felt heavier than the last. He couldn't sleep, the weight of responsibility pressing on him, forcing him to confront the reality that this wasn't just about his father. This was about every person who had ever been wronged by the system, every elderly person who had been ignored or mistreated simply because they were vulnerable, every individual who had been seen as suspicious for reasons beyond their control. This was about justice for all of them. The first major step came a few days after the press conference, when Chief Harris called Daniel into her office. He had known the call was coming, but he wasn't sure what to expect. Her reputation was one of pragmatism. She was a no-nonsense leader who had spent years managing difficult situations. Still, Daniel had his doubts about whether she could truly make a change within her department. When he arrived at her office, she was sitting behind her desk, her hands folded neatly in front of her. There was a heaviness in the room, a palpable tension that mirrored the weight of the moment. "Mr. Grayson," she began, her voice measured, "thank you for coming in today. I wanted to personally update you on the progress we've made regarding your father's case and the department's review of Officer Reynolds." Daniel nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. "I'm listening." "We've conducted an internal review of Officer Reynolds' actions on the night in question," she said. "We've also initiated a broader review of the department's use of force protocols, particularly when interacting with vulnerable individuals, including the elderly and disabled." Daniel raised an eyebrow. What does that mean, exactly? We're updating our training program, Chief Harris explained. Starting immediately, we'll be implementing more comprehensive de-escalation tactics, focusing on communication and mental health awareness. We've already consulted with outside experts to help redesign our curriculum. Officer Reynolds is currently on administrative leave while the investigation continues, and we're working with external agencies to ensure transparency in our findings. Daniel felt a flicker of hope, but he couldn't afford to let his guard down just yet. That's a good start, he said cautiously. But what about Officer Reynolds? He assaulted my father. He acted without cause. Shouldn't he be held accountable for his actions? Chief Harris' eyes darkened, but she remained composed. The investigation is ongoing, Mr. Grayson. I understand your anger, and I promise you that we're not sweeping this under the rug. We're working with the state police to conduct an independent review. If Officer Reynolds is found to have violated department policy or engaged in misconduct, he will face disciplinary action. Daniel nodded slowly, processing the information. And what about the community? How are you planning to rebuild the trust that's been broken? We're holding a town hall meeting next week, Chief Harris said, her voice firm but conciliatory. I'll be there to answer questions, and we'll be opening up the floor for residents to voice their concerns and offer suggestions. This isn't just about what happened to your father. It's about restoring trust between the police department and the community we serve. Daniel wasn't entirely convinced, but he could see the sincerity in Chief Harris's eyes. She was trying, at least. I appreciate that, Chief, he said. But this can't just be about a few weeks of meetings or a handful of policy changes. This has to be about real, lasting change. The culture within this department needs to shift. You need to make sure this doesn't happen again, not just to my father, but to anyone. Chief Harris met his gaze, her jaw set with determination. I understand, Mr. Grayson, and I assure you, we're committed to making that change. As Daniel left the police department, he felt a mixture of guarded optimism and lingering uncertainty. He knew the road ahead would be long, but there was a glimmer of hope that change was possible. The police department's willingness to review its practices was a step in the right direction, but he wasn't about to rest on his laurels. There was still much to be done. That evening, Daniel returned home to his father, who had been following the developments on television. Walter was sitting in his favorite chair, a soft blanket draped over his legs, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. His face, though still swollen from the pepper spray, bore a look of quiet pride. Son, Walter said softly as Daniel entered, how'd it go with the chief? Daniel took a seat beside him, his heart aching with both pride and sadness. It's a start, Dad. They're reviewing their policies, rethinking their training. They're going to make some changes, but we'll have to keep pushing. We can't let this be a temporary fix. Walter nodded slowly, his gaze distant. I didn't ask for any of this, Daniel. You didn't either, but I'm proud of you for standing up. You've got a fire in you. Just don't let it burn out. Daniel looked at his father, the weight of his words sinking in. I won't, Dad. I promise. Over the next few days, the community response was a mix of support and skepticism. There were those who rallied behind Daniel's cause, who saw the fight for justice as something larger than one incident. They understood the need for change, but there were also those who wanted the situation to just blow over. The skepticism was palpable, especially from the older residents who had always believed in the police and felt that the town's reputation was being unfairly tarnished. It was during a town hall meeting at Cedarwood Grove's Community Center that Daniel would come face to face with this divided sentiment. The room was packed, with people lining the walls and spilling into the hallway. Daniel stood at the front, his posture strong, ready to speak his mind. Thank you all for coming, Daniel began, his voice steady but filled with resolve. I'm here today because something went terribly wrong in this town. My father, a man who spent decades building this community, was treated like a criminal. And that's not just his problem. It's all of our problem. He paused for a moment, his eyes sweeping across the room. Some faces were familiar, others were not. But each person in that room had a stake in what happened next. The police department has promised to make changes, Daniel continued. But it's not just about new policies. It's about a shift in mindset. We need to ensure that every person in this town, regardless of age, race, or physical ability, feels safe and respected. And that starts with us. It starts with us holding each other accountable, not just for our actions, but for the way we treat one another every day. A voice from the back of the room interrupted. This is a small town, Grayson. We don't need the outside world telling us how to run things. Your father was an isolated case. Daniel's gaze hardened. It's not just about my father, he said. It's about making sure something like this never happens again. It's about ensuring that no one, no matter who they are, is ever treated like a threat because of their age or their circumstances. We are all responsible for the community we live in. The room fell silent, and Daniel could feel the weight of his words sinking in. The battle was far from over, but it was in moments like these, when truth collided with resistance, that change had the potential to take root. And for Daniel, that was enough to keep fighting. Because in the end, it wasn't just about what happened to his father, it was about making sure that justice and humanity were woven into the fabric of Cedarwood Grove, one step at a time.